Hey, everybody. I've been reading George Jones's autobiography. It's called George Jones, I Live to Tell It All with Tom Carter. And it's really good. And the whole first half of this book is George Jones getting drunk and fighting somebody. And if it's a movie, it's pretty funny. If it's Burt Reynolds punching Terry Bradshaw in the mouth in a bar, and Terry Bradshaw spits a tooth at him and smiles, and you see the empty space where that tooth once was, and then Terry Bradshaw commences to kick Burt Reynolds' ass all over that bar. That's funny, and I'll laugh along with anybody. But when it's real life, it's pretty hard to. It's just no way to live, and you could tell George Jones was on a one-way street going nowhere. The bottle was not his friend. We all have those buddies that when they drink, they just become violent and a monster. And it really seems like George Jones might have been that kind of guy. But our story will start. George Jones and Stonewall Jackson were playing a bar in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And somebody said something to somebody, and then some cowboys threw a bottle past Stonewall Jackson's head, and that pissed off George Jones, and that's where the starts in. George yells out, "Who did that? Who's the dumb son of a bitch that tried to hurt my buddy?" "I did," said someone from the darkness. The voice took a human shape that got bigger as it approached. I soon was staring into the eyes of a cowboy towering above me. I must have weighed all of 140 pounds. "You ain't got no right to be throwing bottles at my friend." I threw a punch that missed before I was clobbered with a roundhouse that knocked me out. I was later told I flipped over backward in midair. I landed face down in a puddle that was about 8 inches deep. Stonewall said he could only see the back of my head protruding from the water. He ran to me, but the cowboy and his buddies got there first. They began to kick me as I lay unconscious. The air was filled with fists and feet, and Stonewall said he feared I would drown as I lay there unaware of what was happening to me. Seeing that I was out of commission, and probably because they were tired of kicking, the cowboys turned on Stonewall. They beat him so severely that his eyes swelled shut. He couldn't open them the next day. We both took a terrible whipping, and then the drunken good old boys were gone. They probably thought they'd left me for dead. Stonewall was able to shake me awake about the time the police arrived. I went into the men's room to blot the blood and to shake off the stage suit I was still wearing from our show. It was the only one I owned, and the following day I had to buy some street clothes to wear on our next show. That fight never made any headlines, yet it could have been fatal if Stonewall hadn't got my head out of the water. That wouldn't have been much of a way to die, but my life back then wasn't much of a way to live. That's pretty heavy words. There's also a story of George Jones touring with Mel Tillis in 1959. They were somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and George seemed to have this habit of breaking his arm, and his arm had just gotten out of a cast from something happening. He didn't say what happened earlier, but he decided he was, pissed off at Mel Tillis for some reason, and they start arguing, and George is in the front seat, and Mel Tillis is in the back seat, and George just started swinging on Mel Tillis from the front seat. And Mel Tillis managed to grab his arm and push it down against the seat so he couldn't punch him. And he was pushing as hard as he could, and he ended up breaking George's arm. And they had to go and get his hand put right back in a cast. I guess Mel Tillis used to joke that it would be easier on George Jones if he would just go ahead and get a cast with a zipper so he could put it on, back and forth. There's another story about him being in a hotel room in the Midwest with Red Sovine. Remember Red Sovine from Phantom 309 and Giddy Up Go? And they were playing cards on a day off, and George started getting drunk. And he just decided he was mad at Red Sovine for no real reason and wanted to kick his ass. And he's like, "I'm going to whoop your ass, Red." And Red Sovine sounds pretty wise. He'd been around drunks a lot in his life, and he knew how to diffuse it. And he said, "George, anybody can kick my ass. Why would you want to go ahead and do that if anybody could do it?" And George kind of thought about it and thought, well, what good would that be? A little time goes by, and he gets pissed off at Red's fiddle player for no reason. And the fiddle player runs into the bathroom and locks the door. And George stands outside the door all day long, saying, "When you're gonna have to come out of there sooner or later, and when you do, I'm gonna whoop your ass." And it said that the guy laid down on the floor and slept half the day. Everybody's mad because they might have had to go to the bathroom and they couldn't because George is standing outside there with the guy locked in. Finally, George gave up on him and went over and started punching the radiator for no reason. And that's not the smartest thing to do, a steel radiator. And he breaks his hand in a bunch of places and ends up having to have his hand in a cast for a while. And there was another story. I believe it was I don't know what year it was. It was sometime in 60 or 62. George is playing at a place in Kansas City called the Chestnut Inn, and they would have country singers play for an hour, and then the country singer would go off the stage, and a stripper would come on stage and do a striptease for an hour, and then the country singer would come back up and do another hour, and they would alternate like that. Well, George ends up hooking up with the stripper, and they go back to her place, and they're messing around, and sometime in the middle of the night, the door flies open, and in comes her husband with this big steel chair over the top of his head. And George says he was laying there naked in the bed, laying on his back, and the guy comes down and just starts wailing on him with the chair. And George puts his arm up, and it breaks his arm. He manages to get out of there with his clothes, running naked down the street holding his clothes. And he had to have his arm in a cast, and he would sing for the rest of the years what he said with a microphone while he had his arm in a sling while it healed up. The book goes on, and there's just story after story of George living like that. And I can't imagine being around him. It must have been a nightmare. He'd get bored on the road and start drinking, and then here comes that ugly side and him wanting to fight somebody. There was a story about him, and I forget who he was with. He was with a buddy of him down by the Mexican border, and they went across into Mexico to go drinking, and they ended up in a bar, and there were a few Mexican dudes sitting at the bar, and George gets drunk, walks up to them and tries to talk to them, and they don't speak English. So George figures that's a time to tell them, that he thinks they're ugly, and would smile real big, and they didn't say anything. Obviously didn't know what he was saying. And he'd say something else terrible about them and kept going on, saying something about their mother. And finally they got the idea that George was messing with him and they weren't going to take it. And these 3 or 4 guys all pull out knives, and George and his friend go running out of the bar as these guys chase them in Mexico with knives. And they jump into a taxi cab and start yelling, "Border, border." And the taxi driver didn't speak English, but he understood border. So he started driving towards the border. And he's rolling up the windows as these guys are chasing them, stabbing into the car. And they're rolling up the windows. And when they finally stepped on it, they managed to get away from these guys, and they went across the border. And it just seemed like this kind of thing was happening all the time to George Jones on the road. It's a pretty lousy way to live. It's fun in a movie, but it's not so great as a day-to-day way to go through life. He tells a story about Lefty Frizzell that I think kind of sums up the whole drinking life. It's about Lefty Frizzell, which I love Lefty Frizzell's music, and obviously George did too. But I want to share that with you guys. At one time, Lefty had beautiful stage clothes, a new guitar, a new car, and a twin-engine airplane. Who ever heard of such prosperity for a country star in the 1950s? All of that was mysteriously taken from him, and almost overnight. The man was the Elvis of his time one day and broke the next. There was no explanation about where the money went. He was basically a good old country boy who felt betrayed, and he couldn't handle the pain. It says his spirit broke, from going from the top to the bottom, and he just started drinking and staying home and just drinking constantly. And his wife, it kind of distanced him from his wife, his isolation. He didn't want to go out into the world at all and just stayed in his house. So his wife started telling him, you need to go to church. She started going to church. And as she would try to push him towards that, it made him go even farther away where he didn't want to do that. He goes to church and he ends up hooking up with the women in the church and having a bunch of affairs. So church just became a way for him to meet women. And that ended up getting back to his wife, and they just went ahead and separated parts of the house, and Lefty Frizzell lived in his basement. And it says Lefty lived in that basement with a bed and a stove and ate soup and other canned food. Can you imagine a man whose singing had touched millions having to live alone in such confinement? His drinking, which had been bad for years, grew worse. In his darkened room below the ground, the idol of millions became ill on July 19th, 1975. An ambulance was called. En route to the hospital, he suffered a massive stroke, according to medical records. He was admitted to Nashville Memorial Hospital, where doctors struggled to keep him alive. Lefty Frizzell, 47, was dead by nightfall. Again, this is George Jones talking. The last time I saw Lefty alive was in his basement. It was about 9 a.m. He was hopelessly drunk, and so was I. He drank that vodka like it was Kool-Aid. Seeing him there in that awful state suddenly made me sober. My heart became as broken as his attitude. I wanted to reach out to him, but didn't know how. Other folks who claimed to be his friends had come by. Some brought him vodka, and I wondered what kind of friends they really were. I wanted to say so much to him, but ultimately I didn't say much at all. We both knew he was on the bottom, and there was no point in talking about it out loud. That wouldn't have helped a thing. When I remember Lefty, I remember that voice, those hits, and a gentle spirit who also trusted folks who were untrustworthy. I honestly believe that helped kill him. That's George Jones talking about Lefty Frizzell. For what it's worth, if you're watching a movie and it's Burt Reynolds and he's fighting bad guys in a bar, it's pretty funny. But when it's real life, man, it's heavy. And there's a lot of real life in this book. And I got a feeling George Jones, it was probably really hard on the people that loved him and were around him. I'm guessing it was probably a real rough way to go through life. But if you have any George Jones stories, that you know that I don't, or if you've read this book, tell me what you thought about it. But go ahead and like this video, leave me a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you guys somewhere down the road. Much love to you.